There have been several videos out, different places on YouTube, talking about this so-called National Sunday Law. Most of the time it's promoted by members of the Seventh Day Adventist organization. And there's quite a few videos up just totally showing how stupid this National Sunday Law really is. But why Seventh Day Adventists want to use it so much, especially to slander the Catholic Church with, I don't think people are quite aware of the origin of this so-called National Sunday Law and just how stupid it really is, and why the Seventh Day Adventist organization are so ignorant that they can't figure this out, and they try to keep it alive today. It goes back, you've got to go back to the 1800s when William Miller started dabbling in predicting the return of Jesus Christ. First, he had no business doing it to begin with. He had no theological education whatsoever and just thought he could take a Bible and just make passages of Scripture, take them totally out of context and make them mean what he wanted them to mean. And so through his so-called studies, he predicted the return of Christ in 1843. Actually 1843, 1844. When he didn't come back in 1843, it was Ellen White who said that God's hand had hit a mistake on this big chart that William Miller had, and that the mistake was that Jesus wasn't coming back in 1843. He was coming back on October 22nd of 1844. So there's how Ellen White got into the predicting of the return of Jesus Christ as well. She's the one who said God's hand hit a mistake. Well, naturally, 1844 came and went, and Jesus didn't return. And you had different groups of Adventists at this time, and several of them became known as the Shut Door Adventist. This was would have been Bates, Bates and Ellen White, and who was Ellen Gould at the time, Ellen Gould Harmon at the time, and it would have been James White. So they wanted to keep all this predicting on the return of Jesus Christ alive. A lot of people left and tried to go back to their churches that had been excommunicated from a lot of their churches for this fanatic teaching of William Miller they were trying to spread in their churches, and the majority of Protestant preachers totally rejected this idiotic interpretations he came up with. And people had sold their land, had sold their fortunes, believing in Miller, believing that Jesus Christ was going to come back in 1844. And when he didn't, you can imagine the disappointment that they really had. It is reported by some articles I read that some of them even committed suicide because Jesus didn't come back. But no, Ellen White and Bates and James White wouldn't follow their pride of sin of pride and let this go. They had to come up with something. So it was James Bates who originally got into predicting the return of Christ in 1851, and then Ellen White got involved in it with him. He came up with a 7-year tarrying period there, which would go from 1844 to 1851. And here's how ignorant he was. He was no Bible theologian either. He used a totally non-prophetic verse, turned it into a prophetic verse, and then tried to predict the return of Christ. And he was using the 7 drops of blood sprinkled on the altar on the Day of Atonement out of Leviticus chapter 16. So that is a non-prophetic verse of Scripture. It has nothing to do with prophecy. But yet he turns it into a prophetic verse of Scripture. It says, okay, it's going to be 7 years before Jesus comes back now. So this is when Ellen White gets, remember she had to have her visions, so she'd go in a room, have some fit or some vision or something come out, and yeah, that's right, and then everybody went with then on. So anyway, they had to be something that distinguished them from Protestants, other Protestants, and other so-called Adventists of the time. Now, remember, at this time, in 1844, Ellen White was not a Sabbatarian. She had come from a Methodist background, and her and her family got excommunicated from the Methodist organization. Excuse me. And so she was actually worshipped on Sunday. So James Bates comes along and convinces her that the reason Jesus didn't come back is people aren't following the commandments of God, especially the Sabbath. So now all of a sudden in 1846, she becomes a Sabbatarian. And this is when she goes along, where she's supposed to be carried to heaven, and God showed her everything around heaven and opened up the Ark of the Covenant. There's the highlighted in the Ten Commandments is the fourth commandment, and she calls the Sabbath the greatest command of all. And so now, voila, here comes the Sabbath now. And of course, that totally contradicts Jesus, who said the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. But of course, Ellen White is a modern prophet, and they don't believe Jesus has a right to say anything, I guess. So I guess to the Seventh Day Adventist, she can override Jesus and make the Sabbath command the greatest commandment, when Jesus said that the loving God was the greatest commandment. So anyway, the Sabbath comes into issue now, and it distinguishes them from the rest of the people. And all the rest of these Protestant churches, remember the Catholic Church wasn't involved in this, because they thought the Catholic Church was already apostate anyway. So they distinguished themselves from other Protestants because they're the only ones keeping the commandments of God, and especially the Sabbath. And so, it's mighty strange, though, if God showed her this the greatest commandment of all, it seemed like he would have told her when to keep the Sabbath as well. For 9 years, they actually kept the Sabbath from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., from Friday 6 p.m. to Saturday 6 p.m. And they did that for 9 years, when the Bible actually talks about the Sabbath being from sunset to sunset. So God showed the greatest commandment, but he failed to tell her what time it was. Yeah, right. So anyway, this goes on and on. And this is the distinguishing thing between them and other churches now, is that they keep the Sabbath and the commandments of God. And when you say commandments of God, they only mean the Ten Commandments. They just totally throw away the other commandments and think that the Ten Commandments are all out there by themselves. So now the Sabbath is in the picture. So they go along, and in the 1880s now, there was this thing in Congress to pass a national Sunday law. So now this is when Ellen White comes out with the Seventh Day Adventist organization is going to be persecuted, thrown in jail, and whatever when they pass this national Sunday law. When Congress passes this national Sunday law in the 1880s, that is all it pertained to. Is the Congress then getting ready to pass a national Sunday law? Ellen White says when this happens, the Seventh Day Adventists are going to be persecuted and thrown in jail for not worshiping on Sunday. so anyway, voila, Congress doesn't pass this national Sunday law. It doesn't happen. And it's only supposed to happen here in the United States anyway. That was it, the end of the story. It died right then. The national Sunday law that Ellen White was promoting ended right then and there when Congress did not pass the national Sunday law. Not the Seventh Day Adventists, though. They had to keep it going, so they revived it now. And rather than being only in America, as Ellen White talked about, now they want to make it worldwide. So there's going to be a worldwide national Sunday law. And when that passes, we're going to beat them up, throw them in jail, hang them from trees, or whatever they say we're going to do to them. I don't know what all they say we're going to do to them. But the whole thing is totally stupid. That's the bottom line. It ended when Congress didn't pass it in 1880. That's what Ellen White was referring to, not any modern day national Sunday law, because it's not going to happen. But yet they want to use fear-mongering to keep their people in, like, everybody getting ready to pass the national Sunday law. What are we going to do now? They're coming for the clubs, they're going to get us and chuck us in jail or something. It's not going to happen. It ended that stupid prophecy that she predicted then. In fact, she was predicting the return of Christ in the 80s, actually, because she said time is very short now. In other words, she again is getting ready to predict the return of Christ. When they pass this national Sunday law, she thinks Jesus is going to return again. But it didn't happen. The national Sunday law, as far as the Seventh Day Adventist organization, ended right then and there. They revived it now and are promoting it again. Only it's not going to be only in America, as Ellen White talked about. It's going to be worldwide now. The whole thing is just ridiculous. It takes illiterate people to believe something that stupid. They cannot go back and search their own history to find out Ellen White was talking about this happening in the 1880s, not the present day. But if they want to live in darkness, let them live in darkness. Let the dead bury the dead. Until next time, this has been Golly saying, God